Yes, yes, yes. It's the Raphael Dawkins with the Combat Radio. And today we're looking at the UFC. The UFC model is the model better than the boxing model. And we delve into some of Rick Glaser's observations about that model and how they pay, or should I say fail to pay their fighters the appropriate percentage of profits. Okay, so this has been a long held belief, philosophy about the UFC. UFC back in the day, 10, 12, 15 years ago, Quinton Rampage Jackson came up with the slogan for UFC, "You fight cheap." That's when he was campaigning over there in Pride, over there in Japan. And they were getting well paid. They used to mock UFC fighters. UFC, you fight cheap. So we're going to listen to some of Rick Glaser's observations on the subject matter. And then I'll go ahead and give you my take. And we're going to hear from a UFC veteran and see how he feels about it. Okay, so first and foremost, let's hear from Rick Glaser.
BH coming through. Does Rick and Rafi think the UFC model over the past weekend is a good example for boxing to follow? That's
No.
Question.
No, it was way too early, and it came out in the Wall Street Journal since Saturday night this week, and I tweeted my comment on it. It shows you how desperate they were because Endeavor borrowed, which owns 51% of the UFC, which is a big financial entertainment conglomerate. They borrowed $260 million at 11% interest, which is highway robbery. I know a guy that just borrowed millions at 3.25%. So wow. Give you an idea how desperate they are. And they needed to get that show off the ground for gross proceeds, for profits, to pay their overhead because they haven't had done a show in months. And that's what reality is. And it was not a good example to follow. Now, if you're talking about the modus operandi of physically doing the show, I don't know about that. I don't know about that either. But the one team, one fighter, and two or three of his handlers had the coronavirus. I don't know if the whole thing was good. I think it was way, way too early. I think the earliest boxing should come back is late June, early July, and that a 10-day period there. And that's when Bob Arum is planning shows, and that's when Golden Boy's coming back on July 4th. And I think that they should have waited. But obviously they were desperate. They were so desperate, they were going to do a show 3 weeks ago against California law on a Native American reservation in California. Then they were talking about going to a private island, but the problem was there's so many restrictions on air travel right now from all these different countries. So it was not a good idea to do that show. Let's see what becomes of it. They've got some other shows scheduled going forward. And you know what? Great. Fantastic. Fantastic for Dana White and UFC, but obviously they needed the money. Because I feel it was an act of desperation. Now, some people could look at it and say, oh, he was he's aggressive. No. Yeah, Bob Arum doesn't need the money. Oscar doesn't need the money. They're just sitting there and waiting. Okay, they are in waiting. Okay, and they will do their shows in a timely, orderly fashion. They don't need UFC to show them what to do. Okay, especially Bob Arum.
But it's not a shame. It's no embarrassment for a company to need that cash flow. It ain't no shame. It ain't no embarrassment.
It's an embarrassment to have to borrow $260 million at 11%. That's an embarrassment. Woo.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I've given out street loans for 10% a year.
Well, I mean, I know a lot I know a lot about the UFC. I was well, it's a long story, but anyway, I know a lot about the UFC. I've been following them for a long time, and I know that when they were sold to Endeavor, they were sold at a bit of a peak. It was a bit of a peak for the UFC, but a lot of their stars were leaving. Ronda Rousey was leaving. Conor McGregor had just, what, I think he just lost, or he was about to lose. They bought it and then he lost. So that was a big two major star powers, star entities for the UFC. One of them became non-existent because she left, Ronda Rousey.
To show you what their sport's all about compared to boxing, Wilder and Fury just got 28 million apiece and did 875,000 people on pay-per-view. He goes and pays these guys 400 and some thousand apiece in the main event, 300 some thousand in the co-feature, and so on down the line, and does 700,000 homes. I think he's taking advantage of the fighters slightly.
That's long been known. That's long been known. They sold to Endeavor when they were at a peak, and they were coming down from the peak. So basically, to put it in layman's terms, Endeavor bought the UFC at a time where, for a house buyer, it would be the equivalent of when the stock house prices were at its highest. That's when Endeavor bought the UFC. And as for the payments to the fighters, yeah, that's been a gripe that's been going on now since Tito Ortiz 10 years ago. That's been a big gripe. Talking about Dana driving around with Ferraris, and they're driving around in a little woofties or whatever you call it over there. So that's been a long held gripe with the UFC. They pay cheap.
No, I wouldn't call it cheap. That's not the right word. What the right word is, it's called they're looking to retain dollars and make profits, and they're depressing the value of their own fighters with intent. They don't let the fighters get too big anymore. That's what they do. They have more volume fighters, and they're not relying on one or two fighters like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor. They've got a lot of guys making 400, 450, 500,000 rather than paying one guy, ridiculous money like a Conor McGregor.
So with the figures that you just mentioned for the UFC, with those figures that you just mentioned, in terms of taking at the gate and how many homes, PPVs they sold, how much would those 400,000 guys, the $400,000 guys, how much would they be making in a boxing match based on the figures that you just mentioned?
It was very simple. Wilder and Fury just made 28 million apiece. I mean, and did 175,000 more homes. So should they be getting 10 million apiece, 7.5 million apiece? Well, they have more fights on a show. So let's say you should get 3-4 million apiece. The top guy, some of the co-features, $1 million apiece. That would be pretty equal. Okay, yeah. So they're grossly underpaid, maybe 10 times the amount underpaid. Maybe they're getting 10% of what they should be getting.
That's foul. That's foul. That's foul. That's foul when you break it down like that. It's often been a gripe with UFC fighters for a long time now. And damn, those figures are kind of horrific. But hold on. Do you really think that Wilder and Fury got 28 million for their last fight?
Oh yeah, forget what was in the contract. The contract's just because of the boxing commissions and the taxes on the foreign fighter. The two 20 million apiece.
How much? 20 million apiece.
28.
28 million apiece.
Yep.
Is that after taxes or before?
No, that was before.
Okay, before taxes and all the expenses and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We got one. El Jefe's got another one here.
El Jefe's got another one. Will Zanfer.
Okay, so those are Rick Glaser's words. Headline acts should be getting at least 8 million. That's a very low figure. Sorry, what did I say? 8? At least 4. At least 4. That's a low figure for a headline act. And I know some people will be saying, well, hey, Conor McGregor's highest headline act was 8. Yeah, that may be so. But generally, these guys in the UFC, they're not getting paid the percentage of profits that other sports pay. They pay a small fraction of the profits that you'll find in the NFL. Smaller percentage of profits that you'll find in the NBA. Way smaller percentage of the profit that you will find in boxing. So the few guys that get paid half decently, they are not representative of the bulk of fighters. And we're not talking about the undercard fighters, we're talking about the main event fighters, very poorly paid. Even the undercard fighters could get a bigger percentage. Should have pulled that article up, but we're going back some years now when an article was published showing the tiny fraction of a percentage of the profits that the UFC pays to its fighters. It's tiny. Nowhere near comparable with other sports. And so, yeah, it's totally a legitimate claim that the UFC, headed by Dana White, underpays its fighters wickedly. Very, very wickedly. And with that, let's get to one of the pioneers of the sport. This is an article with the words of Don Fry. There is Don Fry, veteran of the sport. Let's have a look at what he had to say. Okay, so Don Fry, Dana White and his 30 Ferraris ruined the sport of MMA. And this was way back in 2012, so you can see this ain't no new thing. Okay, so Dana White responds to Don Fry via his official Twitter account. Remember, this is 2012. Nothing ain't changed. Okay, so Dana White says, my car ruined the sport. Don Fry is one of those fighters who is bitter. He didn't make the money these guys make. Guess what, Don Fry? I have 2 of them, and I earned them both by working my ass off. Go count your money, not mine. Effing crybaby. And one more thing. Koshak. He's talking about Josh Koshak, ex-UFC fighter. Koshak has 2 of them also, and he earned them. Go get a job done, Fry. Okay, I'm done. Loud. Okay, so 40-something mixed martial arts veteran Don Fry. He says 40-something, that's his age. He's obviously 50-something now, since this was 12 years ago. Don Fry, who started his career with 7 straight bouts under the Ultimate Fighting Championship banner. That was before Zuffa took over. The Fertitta brothers. The Fertitta brothers, casino owners, casino family out of LA. They took it over and put Dana White in there to run it. He convinced them to buy it, and they let him run it for the most part. They came in later when, after Dana had started turning into a big success. Ironically, it really took off with the Ultimate Fighter program, the reality series, Tough, The Ultimate Fighter, which turned the UFC into a mega company. Ironically, it is known that Dana White was not a fan of the idea. He didn't like it. But so it's interesting that the thing that made the UFC a major company was an idea that Dana White did not like or support. Had to be talked into it. But that's just the irony of it. But he certainly did work his ass off. He certainly was on them private planes, flying here, there, everywhere, making deals, accompanied by some very, very beautiful ladies. But that's another story. Okay, so let's stick with this. Yeah, Don Fry still loves the sport of cage fighting, in spite of the UFC president Dana White, the Predator. And I may as well add at this point that Don Fry is not the only ex-fighter or even current fighter who has had their run-ins with Dana White over money, over the tiny percentage that the UFC pay in comparison to other sports. It's got to be the lowest. Okay, so the Predator, that's his nickname, told Sherdog that MMA was ruined by the penny-pinching promoter who brags about his 30 Ferraris whilst making 1,000 heirs out of undercard competitors. Yeah, it's just a couple of thousand is what Don Fry is saying. The fans are fantastic. But the thing is, Dana White ruined the sport. I got to thinking about it today, and you know, he ruined it for me. It's a crime. You see some of these guys only getting $2,000 or $3,000 to $6,000 on the undercard. And then you've got Dana White bragging about having 30 Ferraris. Come on. You have a sponsor. And then he charges a sponsor, what, 150 grand to have your stuff on the fighter? That's money he's stealing from the fighter. Then he goes and he pays them $2,000 or $3,000. It's crazy, man. Crazy. So Fry is piggybacking off recent complaints from the boxing industry, amongst others, that the UFC is running a monopoly after effectively absorbing any and all competition that possesses any kind of threat or poses any kind of threat. Pride from Japan, the WEC, an American company, Strikeforce. Hold on, Strikeforce was the UK. Strikeforce was a very entertaining UK company. Guys like Epstein, Murray, Bisping hailed from Strikeforce. I wish we still had it, but UFC bought it, swallowed it up, and that was the biggest UK organization at the time. Okay, so despite the stranglehold Zuffa has on stateside MMA, there are still plenty of places for combat sports athletes to compete, such as Maximum Fighting Championship, Dream out of Japan, ONE FC out of Japan, and BAMA. I think they're defunct now. Don't quote me on that. And the UFC has made its share of the millions. Nevertheless, Fry is perturbed about the way some of the spoils are shared amongst the roster, and even goes as far as to call it stealing from the fighters. Yep, it's not new. It's not a new allegation. So, the allegation that the UFC are stealing from the fighters appear to be borne out in the facts and figures. UFC only pay a tiny fraction of their profits to the fighters. Hence, the situation we have now, where UFC is almost universally known as "You Fight Cheap." What say you? It's the Raphael Dawkins. It's the Combat Radio. It's the like. It's the subscribe. It's the comments. It's the shares. And it's the UFC doing things their way. And far from setting a good example, it could be argued they're setting a bad example. Treatment of the fighters. What say you? It's the Raphael Dawkins. It's the Combat Radio. It's the Have Your Say It's the like, it's the subscribe, it's the comments, it's the shares. It's the hitting the bell icon. And it's the looking out for the live shows. Boxing Talk with Rafi. Mondays and Wednesdays. And then on the Fridays, it's Boxing Talk and Classic Fight Review. Don't be afraid to hit that share button under the video and share it on your social media platforms. It's the Raphael Dawkins. It's the Combat Radio. And I'm out.